We've now got our first example of state being used inside of a React component. Now, I want to very quickly go over a little lifecycle diagram and really explain what's going on inside of our application step by step. After that, I'm going to show you a couple of special notes that you need to be aware of around state, and then we'll start to work on our second example to work with it. So let's get to it. So everything starts with our app first booting up. At some point in time, we then eventually navigate to our counter screen. It's only at that point in time, like when we actually navigate to that screen, that our counter screen function runs for the very first time. When that function runs for the first time, we then initialize our counter piece of state. It starts off with a default value of 0. And remember, it is specifically 0 because when we called usestate, we passed in a value of 0 right there. That defines the starting value of counter. Then, at some point in time in the future, the user eventually taps on the increase button, or maybe it's decrease, either one. And when that happens, the onPress callback is executed. So that's the onPress callback that we passed as a prop right here. Inside that prop, we then make a call to setCounter. Remember, setCounter is a function that we use to update the value of our state variable. React does not magically detect if you and I make a change manually to the counter variable. So the only way that we're ever going to update that variable is by calling that setter function. After a very brief pause after that, and I say very brief pause right here because if you technically go back over here and do a console log of counter right after we update its value, you're going to see that counter still has the exact same value. And the reason for that is that setCounter doesn't technically update the value of counter right away. It happens at some point in time shortly after that. So after a very brief pause, React then will automatically re-render, or essentially rerun, our entire counter screen component. So that entire function gets invoked automatically a second time. The second time it runs, React knows that counter screen already was executed one time before. So the second time it runs, that state variable of counter, it doesn't get somehow magically initialized back to 0 a second time. So React always knows if a component has been rendered already. The second time it gets re-rendered, it's not going to be initialized again. The second time that counter screen is executed, that value of counter is now going to have an updated value of 1. So if we looked at the value of counter, it would then be simply 1. And so then inside of our JSX block, we can then reference that updated counter variable. We can return it from inside of that JSX block and see the value 1 print up on the screen. So that's what's going on behind the scenes. Now I want to give you just a couple of quick notes here. Some things you need to be aware of as we are using state. The first thing I want to mention is that right now we are using function-based state inside of a functional component. In other words, the component we created is an actual JavaScript function. We can also create components out of JavaScript classes as well. And inside of those other type of components, we can use a very similar state system, but the syntax for it is just a little different. We're going to eventually look at class-based components later on, but for right now, we're sticking with functional-based components just because they're kind of seen as where React as a library is headed towards. In general, the community is favoring functional components. That's why I'm concentrating on them so much inside this course. But you can also make use of class-based components and use state with them as well. And as I mentioned, we'll take a look at that later on. Now, I just want to repeat that we're never going to modify directly a state variable. So we're never going to write some code like that. We're never going to write out something like counter equals counter plus 1. We're never going to see counter on the left-hand side of an equal sign. That's bad and we don't want to do it. Instead, to update our state variable, we are always going to use that setter function that we get back whenever we call that usestate function. Next up, we can name that state variable absolutely anything we wish. We called it counter because it, well, made a lot of sense inside this example. We could have just as easily called it current count, or my counter, or whatever else. You can call it anything you wish. In general, just like those prop names, you just want to name your state variables something that makes sense to you and other developers. Next up, we can track any kind of data that's going to change over time. So in this case, we were tracking a number that changes. We could also track a string or an array of objects or just about anything else that we want to track using a state variable. It does not have to be a simple primitive value like a number or a string. It could be more complex values as well. Now, one thing I want to mention in passing here is that whenever our component gets re-rendered because we update our state variable, all of that component's children will be re-rendered as well. So remember, we can nest a React component that we create inside of another. If we had done that for our counter screen right here, so if we had placed another component inside of here that you and I created, and then we updated our state variable, that would cause our child component to be re-executed as well a second time. So using this state thing is a really easy way to get our entire application or parts of our application to automatically update at some point anytime our data changes. And finally, this is the kind of thing that makes state and props a little bit confusing. A state variable can be passed down to a child component. So at that point in time, that value is then kind of simultaneously a piece of state and a prop as well. And so this is where people start to get really confused on the difference between state and props. And we're going to be definitely looking at an example of this very shortly so you can see exactly how it works. All right, so last thing I want to mention here just very quickly, this might sound a little bit confusing when I just use words to describe it. We're going to see an example of this with some code as well. But whenever we create an instance of counter screen, in other words, whenever we show counter screen on our device, if we show multiple copies of it for some reason, each separate copy of this component will have its own separate state variable. Now, the reason that's relevant, if you recall back inside of our components directory, we created that image detail component right here, and we showed multiple copies of this, 3 to be precise. If we had added a state variable inside of here, each of those 3 different copies of image detail that we had created would have its own separate and independent state variable. So essentially, every time that we create an instance of a component and we try to show it on the screen, every copy of it has its own separate pieces of state. And once again, we're going to look at an example of that as well. I just want to mention it in passing right now in case you're curious. Okay, so that's it. Just some high-level notes around state. So let's take another quick pause right here.